8.5 billion people around the world were affected by the Microsoft security outage on Friday. Swathes of workers opened up their computers to the blue screen of death. Many took it upon themselves to bunk off work. Obviously, GB News viewers would resort to the typewriter and handwritten notes, mine on parchment. But the same can't be said for goat milk drinking Guardian readers. I digress. Now, many issues can be related back to the European Union. One example allegedly being this IT outage. It has been reported Microsoft has blamed the EU for the outage after it was made to sign a 2009 contract preventing it from making security changes. Well, I'm joined now by Chairman and CEO of the Cyber Security Association, Chris Windley. Chris, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Great to be here.
Thank you. Do you think Microsoft is just passing the buck, or do you think they've got a real point?
I tell you what I think. Microsoft are very upset at the amount of money that these companies have made over the years, Jacob, right? Companies like CrowdStrike and SentinelOne and Qualys during the COVID period had huge valuations. Some of them that went from $1 billion to $10 billion. So they stole a very lucrative bit of business that Microsoft might have had, Jacob.
OK, and do you think that Microsoft, if it had kept the code internally, would have avoided this problem? Because obviously Apple and Google have kept this type of code internally.
Well, I tell you what I do agree with, right? I mean, obviously, the stuff that we're doing at the minute is extremely complex, isn't it? Right? And we've got lots of moving parts and there's lots of opportunity for things to go wrong, right? So I get that, definitely you can understand, right? The less players that there are in the mix and that, the less complication there is to a large extent. I definitely agree with that, Jacob.
And I wonder if the European Union was naive and failed really to understand the market when it made this requirement of Microsoft, because actually Apple developed and Google developed and other competitors have come in to a fast-growing, developing market in a way that Microsoft at one point seemed so dominant that it looked unlikely it would happen.
Well, and I think the other point there as well, Jacob, is they haven't done the same to Google and Apple that they did to Microsoft, right? And I do actually agree, that they could have been a bit heavy-handed. I mean, obviously, they won't understand the complexity of this and the implications of it, will they? So I do actually agree with that, that they probably were a bit heavy-handed.
Well, I always thought it was a slightly anti-American approach, that this is a great American company. We're the European Union. We don't have a proper European competitor. Let's see if we can bash the US. And that it came out of envy and has come back and damaged a lot of European consumers.
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, in America, they themselves have pursued Microsoft over various things and that. I don't think to the extent I'm not an expert, but from to the extent that the EU have pursued them, right? But, they've been pursued in America as well on this basis, haven't they? I think one of the interesting things here is you sort of say, because really it's CrowdStrike, issue, or largely a CrowdStrike issue and you sort of say, is this a security or a cybersecurity or a software issue? It's a very interesting question.
And it's slightly unfortunate that it's called CrowdStrike, isn't it? Because they ended up striking the crowd, which may mean they should change their name.
Yeah, it's also slightly unfortunate that one of their customers is the Department of Defence as well.
Indeed, yes. Well, let's hope Putin hasn't been tuning in to get the latest news on CrowdStrike. Thank you very much, Chris. Well, I'm joined now by my distinguished panel of former Conservative MP Philip Davis and the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole Turner. Amy, this is the EU. Didn't really understand computing. Still thought we should be using the abacus, came in with heavy-handed regulation and bungled. And aren't we lucky to be out of it?
I don't know. I feel like this topic is giving bendy bananas. Do you remember when you tried to blame the EU for COVID?
It was true, that regulation existed.
All right. Well, then it's worse than bendy bananas.
It's worse than bendy bananas.
Right. So the way I could understand this is basically they insisted that two people have a pair of the keys to this software. And it's much better and less risky, surely, for there to be two pairs of keys, because if you lose one, you're really in trouble.
I don't think it is, because it's a very complex integrated system. And if
But at
you
the core
extract a bit out of it, then you have somebody who can put in an error, whereas if it were under Microsoft's control, there would have been much greater
But
protection.
that's the point I'm making. It's better to have it outside of Microsoft additionally, because if something goes wrong, you want to have two ways into it. That's as far as I understand it, but it's very tricky, I have to say.
I'm impressed, Jacob, at your technical knowledge here, to be perfectly honest. I always had you penciled in as a Luddite, to be perfectly honest. I've been overwhelmed by your knowledge on technology. Look, you wouldn't have to work hard to persuade me that the EU were to blame for anything, to be perfectly honest, and particularly this. And I suspect it was a load of meddlesome bureaucrats wanting to stick their nose into things without really knowing what they were doing. But I don't think we should just let Microsoft off the hook here, because I'd have had more sympathy if Microsoft were on every day on the media saying these EU rules are going to lead to a catastrophe. And to the best of my knowledge, I can't remember hearing this from Microsoft every 5 minutes. It seems to be being wise after the event. So I'll blame the EU all day long, but I think Microsoft should take their fair share.
To be fair to Microsoft, they had a long battle with the Commission over this antitrust monopolistic investigation, and they were very critical of what the EU was doing at that point. They certainly didn't help us in 2016, but big corporations are like that. Amy, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think it's a really interesting point that only 1% of the Microsoft systems went down. You imagine? Imagine if it was 100%.
Yeah.
It just shows how much we depend on this stuff. And I think surely the real problem here was that we didn't have backup, rather than who to blame.
But how much backup can you have? How realistic does that become? If you back up every system, your costs balloon, and all of that has to be passed on to consumers. What level of risk do you take?
I honestly, I find this incredibly uninspiring, this story, I have to say. But try to get on board with it as much as possible. And it just seems to make sense to me to have a bit more of an insurance policy around these things
than
what we've got.
So if you've got cash,
exactly.
Things.
Exactly. This shows the folly of this cashless society that we're trying to foist on people, and all this digital banking.
You can't fly planes by carrying cash.
No,
there was more to it than that.
But people, it's interfering with people's lives in a way, and people should be trusted to run their own life. They shouldn't be forced down a particular route when the technology clearly can't be trusted to do it. So, it does show the folly of going down a cashless society route.
And people going to supermarkets couldn't pay for their food if they were trying to do it in a cashless way, whereas if they took notes out of their wallet, they could pay.
Again, though, I don't think that all the things that went wrong that day could be solved by...
all the fault of the EU.
So
the EU meant people couldn't eat. They couldn't buy their food.
You too. It's all the EU's fault.
Well, on this occasion,
It's a good place to start. It's always a good place to start.
Always the EU's fault. It's everything.
Well, I think the EU's banged to rights here, in spite of the noble efforts of Amy to defend them. Thank you, my panel.